Welcome to the inaugural episode of the UFO UAP Experimental Physics Channel. My name is Robert Francis. The goal of this channel will be a record of my endeavors in conducting experimental physics research inspired by the components seen in the alien reproduction vehicle, also known as the flux liner, as leaked by Brad Sorensen and Mark McCandlish and Leonardo Sanderson and Gordon Novell. The ARV has three main components of interest: the multi-layer parallel plate capacitor array on the bottom of the craft, used for propellantless propulsion; the electromagnetic coil around the circumference of the craft, used for inertia reduction, including relativistic inertia reduction, enabling faster than light travel, as well as for shielding cosmic rays and the solar wind; and finally an electrical generator, which unfortunately was not seen or described in any real detail. It is my goal to experimentally prove those first two components seen by the individuals above do in fact work, and get the knowledge of these technologies made public in order to upgrade the world's transportation systems. The alien reproduction vehicle, or flux liner. I'm convinced that the US government, in cooperation with American defense contractors, have built UFOs of their very own, and that some or even most of the UFOs seen in the world today are in fact created by humanity. The alien reproduction vehicle is one such vehicle, perhaps the first such functional vehicle created by humans. I can't say why I believe exactly. Is it the evidence? I'd prefer to think so. The work of Thomas Townsend Brown on the Biefeld-Brown effect, starting back in 1929, along with the work of countless others who have attempted to, and in some cases have, replicated his experiments over the years, have revealed that pulsed DC inputs into parallel plate capacitors do provide a propulsive effect that is not based on ion wind. The interview with Lockheed Martin's senior scientist, Boyd Bushman, adds another piece of supporting evidence for the ARV when he discussed conducting free-fall experiments with magnets. My work in this regard has verified that a magnet, not unlike the ARV's electromagnetic coil, when moving in the direction of its north to south pole, experiences inertia reduction. All that said, I want to believe. Here's a little backstory. The image of this red UFO with black bubbles on the top, that was first recorded instance of the ARV by the public, and it was back in 1966 in Provo, Utah, where a photograph of a saucer-shaped craft was taken. The craft in the photograph was red in color, and the half-sphere-shaped top with black bubbles and sloping sides. Nothing else was seen or heard about the ARV until 1988. In 1988, a man by the name of Brad Sorensen, according to Mark McCandlish, or a man by the name of Leonardo Sanderson, according to Gordon Novell, attended an air show with a VIP client of theirs, who is said to be a high-level DoD official, possibly former Secretary of Defense Frank Carlucci. It is unknown who the real person was who attended the air show, Sorensen or Sanderson, or if in fact it was another person entirely and McCandlish and Novell were covering for the actual individual. According to McCandlish and Novell, the VIP took Sorensen-Sanderson with him to a large hangar whose access was restricted. The guards instantly recognized the VIP. According to McCandlish, the VIP passed Sorensen off as an aide, allowing Sorensen access to the hangar with the VIP. According to Novell, the VIP had already gotten Sanderson on the need-to-know list prior to the date of the air show. Inside the hangar, Sorensen-Sanderson saw three ARVs of different sizes but the same dimensions and proportions. It is claimed that a general gave a presentation there to the crowd, which included several politicians who were deemed to have a need to know. The presentation was being given to this crowd in order to get their support to fund the construction of a number of ARVs for the military. Considering there are no public photos of the ARV-shaped UFOs since that air show, it is possible the construction of a fleet of ARVs never happened. According to the general giving the presentation, the ARV was capable of faster than light travel. Okay, you can see here the McCandlish ARV Schematic. In 1989, a few months after Sorensen told McCandlish about seeing the ARV, McCandlish had a schematic drawn up and copyrighted of the ARV with its observed components and his interpretation of how the ARV worked. McCandlish stated that the bottom of the craft appeared to be a Biefeld Brown effect capacitor array with 4 layers of capacitors. The bottom plate negative, the plate above positive, the next plate negative, and then positive, and so on. The plates were 1/2 inch thick copper separated by 3/4 inch thick what appeared to be G10 dielectric epoxy glass to contain the electricity. The capacitor array was divided into approximately 42 triangular sections for directional control. McCandlish believed the central column was the secondary coil of a Tesla coil, used to generate the extremely high voltages applied to the parallel plate capacitors on the bottom of the craft. McCandlish believed the electromagnetic coil was the primary coil of said Tesla coil, with an appearance of braided cable surrounded by G10 dielectric glass. Gordon Novell's ARV Illustration. In 2010, Gordon Novell released his book about the alien reproduction vehicle titled Supreme Cosmic Secret: How the US Government Reverse Engineered an Extraterrestrial Spacecraft. The illustration to the right was on the cover. Novell reported the same capacitor array with the same dimensions and materials. Novell reported the presenter in 1988 reported a state change occurred at 1.2 million volts. What that state change was not stated. Novell stated the electromagnetic coil is composed of square copper rod 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch and surrounded by 1/4 inch G10 dielectric. The coil had approximately 1185 turns, and he believed it disrupted the zero-point energy field and engineered the vacuum in line with Hal Puthoff's papers on the subject. My take on the ARV's capacitor array: it's not 4 capacitors layered on top of each other. The Biefeld Brown effect parallel plate capacitor array on the bottom of the ARV should not be seen as 4 parallel plate capacitors layered on top of each other. The two capacitors on top of each other could not be used at the same time, as the bottom capacitor's bottom plate would be negative, the top plate would be positive, the top capacitor's bottom plate would be negative again, and would have an equal force up and down. It would split between the 2 adjacent positive top plates, resulting in no force in that capacitor. Further, if the capacitor array consisted of 4 capacitors on top of each other, the G10 dielectric between each capacitor would serve no propulsive function. Here is an example of what I mean. With plate 1 being negative and plate 2 being positive, plate 1 moves in the direction of plate 2. However, plate 3 would be split. It wants to move in the direction of both plate 4 and plate 2, as they are both higher voltages than plate 3. As a result, if McCandlish and Novell were correct and the plates were layered negative, positive all the way up, only 2 capacitors that are not adjacent to each other could be used at the same time. This would obviously be bad for generating propulsion in the capacitor array. My take on it is an 8-layer Biefeld Brown effect parallel plate capacitor. The G10 dielectric hypothesized to be used and the ARV at the reported 3/4 inch thickness would have a dielectric strength of approximately 600 kilovolts, 600,000 volts. With that in mind, here is how an 8-layer capacitor would function. Let's call the bottom plate plate 1. Plate 1 would be at 0 volts or ground. Plate 2 would be at 600,000 volts. Plate 3 would be at 1.2 million volts. Plate 4 would be at 1.8 million volts. Plate 5 would be at 2.4 million volts. Plate 6 would be at 3 million volts. Plate 7 would be at 3.6 million volts. And plate 8 would be at 4.2 million volts. Such a capacitor could use the entire capacitor thickness at once and not waste any G10 dielectric, as McCandlish and Novell hypothesized the capacitor array working in their analysis. Now, powering the parallel plate capacitor array. Initially, I believed, as McCandlish and Novell did, that the capacitor array consisted of 4 Biefeld-Brown effect capacitors layered on top of each other. In order to power them, I believe that Marx generators were used to apply DC voltages to the capacitors, as Marx generators emit pulse DC currents, and pulse DC works better than static DC, as shown from the existing experimental record related to the Biefeld-Brown effect. McCandlish's schematic showed tall cylinders inside the sphere compartment that were not explained and resemble commercially available Marx generators. My belief on the use of Marx generators, however, has changed. I now believe that inside the tall central column is a secondary coil of a Tesla coil, as McCandlish did. Such a coil of that height would be capable of generating voltages above 4.2 million volts, and could be used to apply currents to all 8 capacitor plates at the same time. However, McCandlish was wrong about the large electromagnetic coil being the primary coil of the Tesla coil, as the greater the number of turns in the primary coil, the lower the voltage increase in the secondary coil. In other words, if the electromagnetic coil was used, the voltage would not be raised to nearly as high a level as if there's only like a couple turns in the primary coil of the Tesla coil. The key to apply pulse DC currents to all 8 plates at the same time is a modified tank circuit. A tank circuit bounces currents between a capacitor and an electromagnetic coil. Depending on the resonant frequency between the capacitor and the coil, pulses of current will bounce back and forth between the two at frequencies in the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of times a second, a far higher pulse rate than a Marx generator could do. It would also discharge the capacitor each cycle, preventing the capacitor from being fully charged and holding a static current in it, as would happen over time with a Marx generator. The key, however, is modifying the standard tank circuit. A standard tank circuit would result in the capacitor's polarity flipping with, for example, the first cycle having a higher voltage on the top plate and lower voltage on the bottom plate, and then the next cycle would have a lower voltage on the top plate and a higher voltage on the bottom plate, which wouldn't work to produce the Biefeld-Brown effect. So here's how the circuit would need to be made. As you can see, the red square, that's the Tesla coil's output at 4.2 million volts. It would go into an inductor, which is an electromagnetic coil, and that inductor is connected to plate 8. Then plate 8 is also connected to inductor 7. Inductor 7 is also connected to plate 7. Plate 7 is also connected to inductor 6. And inductor 6 is also connected to plate 6. Plate 6 is also connected to inductor 5. Inductor 5 is also connected to plate 5. Plate 5 is connected to inductor 4. Inductor 4 is also connected to plate 4. Plate 4 is also connected to inductor 3. Inductor 3 is also connected to plate 3. Plate 3 is connected to inductor 2. Inductor 2 is connected to plate 2. Plate 2 is connected to inductor 1. Inductor 1 is connected to plate 1. And plate 1 is also connected to ground. No one, to my knowledge, has come up with this idea on how the ARV's capacitor array function and how the entire thickness of the capacitor array, all 8 plates, could be powered at the same time. The significance of this idea cannot be overstated. The system would, at its resonant frequency, would bounce currents back between the plates, back to the inductor, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of times a second. The Biefeld-Brown effect. Here are factors observed by Thomas Townsend Brown. Capacitors charged to a high voltage move in the direction from lower voltage to higher voltage capacitor plate. There is a positive correlation between the voltage difference between the capacitor plates and the strength of the effect, where the higher the voltage, the greater the effect. There is a positive correlation between the dielectric strength, its ability to resist the flow of electricity through it, of the material between the electrodes, and the strength of the effect, where the higher the dielectric strength, the greater the effect. There is a positive correlation between the dielectric constant, the ability of the dielectric to store electrical energy of the material between the electrodes, and the strength of the effect, where the higher the dielectric constant, the greater the effect. There is a positive correlation between the area of the capacitor plates and the strength of the effect, where the greater the area of the capacitor, the greater the effect. There is a positive correlation between the mass of the dielectric and the strength of the effect, where the greater the mass, the greater the effect. There is a negative correlation between the distance between the plates of the capacitor and the strength of the effect, where the effect increases linearly with the thinner the dielectric is. Here's a factor observed by Robert Talley. There's a positive correlation with pulsed voltages versus static voltages, where pulsed voltages have a greater effect than static ones, and the higher the pulse rate, the greater the effect. In 1991, Talley conducted experiments on a variety of extremely small capacitors that would fit inside a vacuum chamber for the Air Force in a paper titled 21st Century Propulsion Concept. Talley used static and pulsed voltages of around 19 kilovolts in his experiments, and dielectrics of acrylic and PZT. With acrylic dielectric, Talley measured no movement with a static DC voltage of 19 kilovolts applied. When using pulsed voltages of 19 kilovolts, Talley recorded no movement with the exception of 600 Hertz pulse rate, the highest pulse rate tested. With PZT, Talley saw some interesting results. With a static DC voltage of 19 kilovolts was applied, the PZT dielectric appeared to be pulsing through the dielectric, as if the voltage was too high for the dielectric breakdown strength of the material. That said, he detected movement during the pulses through the PZT. Talley requested additional experiments and funding from the Air Force, but it never came. Here's factors observed by Honda R&D Institute. There is a positive correlation with pulsed voltages versus static voltages, where pulsed voltages have a greater effect than static ones, and the higher the pulse rate, the greater the effect. In 2000 and 2008, Takaki Musha published papers on the results of a Honda R&D capacitor experiment from 1996. Honda used a single capacitor, applying 2 different voltages to it in their experiment. One was a static DC voltage at 18 kilovolts. The other was a pulse DC voltage of 8 kilovolts at 50 Hertz. The experiment showed more weight loss, more of a propulsive effect with the pulsed voltage of 8 kilovolts than with the static voltage of 18 kilovolts, even though the pulsed voltage was less than half the static one. Factors observed by George Matsoukas. There is a positive correlation with pulsed voltages versus static voltages, again, where pulsed voltages have a greater effect than static ones, and the higher the pulse rate, the greater the effect. In 2012, Matsoukas published a paper on the results of his experiment with a lifter. Lifters are extremely lightweight, asymmetrical capacitors composed of balsa wood, wire, aluminum foil, and air as their dielectric. Many do not realize the reason lifters don't work in a vacuum is that the air that was their dielectric is gone and is replaced by vacuum, which is an extremely poor dielectric for use in Biefeld Brown effect experiments. Matsoukas found that inserting a piece of lead sulfide in between the positive wire and negative aluminum foil electrodes, that the lifter lost a greater amount of weight, indicating that the higher dielectric constant of the lead sulfide versus air increased the propulsive force of the lifter. Matsoukas used a voltage of 28 kilovolts and found pulsed voltages between 40 and 80 hertz, lowered the amount of power supplied by the power supply while keeping the lifter weightless. Okay, now here are factors hypothesized by me. High voltages in a parallel plate capacitor create electric dipoles in the atoms and molecules of the dielectric, pulling the negatively charged electron clouds toward the higher voltage plate and the positively charged nuclei toward the lower voltage plate. This causes electric dipoles to have an axis of spin that is perpendicular to the parallel plate capacitor. It is my hypothesis that the electric field of the capacitor polarizes the spin of the unpaired protons in the dielectric, like rotating material with unpaired protons at high speed did under Wallis, Podkleinoff, and Eskridge. Atoms with unpaired protons whose spin are aligned cause other nearby atoms with unpaired protons to align their spin in the same direction as well, as discovered by Wallis. With a higher electric field in the capacitor, the dielectric and its atoms with unpaired protons will more fully align their axis of spin perpendicular to the parallel plate capacitor. It is my hypothesis that the unpaired proton spin alignment of the dielectric spreads to the capacitor plates if they too are made of atoms that have unpaired protons, such as copper or aluminum, and will polarize these plates as well if the capacitor is a multi-layer capacitor like the ARV, or if the voltage of the capacitor is sufficiently high. It is my hypothesis that there is a positive correlation between the mass of the capacitor electrode material and the strength of the effect, where the greater the mass, the greater the effect. A spin alignment factor explains the ARV's array. If the capacitor array and the ARV merely relied on energy stored or pulsed into the capacitor, then the ARV would use extremely thin sheet metal, possibly even as thin as foil, for its electrodes. A capacitor with foil as its electrodes stores just as much electrical energy as a capacitor with thick metal electrodes. So if the Biefeld-Brown effect was based on electrical energy stored or pulsed into the capacitor, then the ARV would not use thick metal electrodes. On the other hand, if what matters is spin alignment of unpaired protons in the capacitor, then you would want as large of a mass as possible with as high a percentage as possible of unpaired protons, all with their spin aligned in the same direction, which I believe the ARV does. Here's a little history on unpaired particle spin alignment. Experiment by Samuel Barnett. Paramagnetism and ferromagnetism are a result of unpaired electron spin alignment in paramagnetic and ferromagnetic materials and causes the force seen in magnets such as refrigerator magnets. The Barnett effect was discovered in 1915 by Samuel Barnett. It is a method of aligning the spin direction of unpaired electrons in what was an iron bar by rotating the iron bar at high speed. With the higher the speed, the greater the magnetization. Barnett proved a method for polarizing unpaired particles, in this case electrons, by high-speed rotation. There's patents by Henry William Wallace. Henry William Wallace was a GE aerospace engineer who discovered and patented the generation of a force that he claimed was not electromagnetic in nature. Wallace used the method used in the Barnett effect, high-speed rotation of a material. But in Wallace's case, it was a material with an unpaired proton in each copper atom rather than unpaired electrons as in iron, which iron does not have an unpaired proton. Wallace further discovered that the force was in a way analogous to magnetism, and that materials with unpaired nucleons have a permeability to this non-electromagnetic force, like materials with unpaired electrons have a magnetic permeability. Wallace also discovered that unpaired spin-aligned nucleons can induce unpaired nucleons to align their spin in the same direction. It can induce nearby unpaired nucleons to align their spin in the same direction as well. Experiments by Eugene Podklenoff. In 1992, Podklenoff discovered that by rotating a YBCO superconducting disk at high speed, the disk would lose some weight and appeared to partially shield gravity on smoke that was above the disk. YBCO contains atoms with unpaired nucleons. In 2020, Podklenoff discovered that by rotating a gold-plated aluminum disk between 8,000 and 12,000 RPMs, it would generate a force capable of lifting hundreds of pounds, and that would create an attractive or repulsive field depending on the configuration of the disk, which he did not elaborate on in an interview. Gold and aluminum atoms both have an unpaired proton. I emailed him asking for additional information, and he stated with an ordinary rotating gold aluminum disk, a repulsive field is emitted from the top and bottom of the disk. Perhaps the field emitting from the bottom causes the propulsive effect, but I believe the repulsive field emitted from the top is not a repulsive field at all. I believe the energized disk is shielding material above it from Earth's gravity. Why? Henry William Wallace mentioned in his patents that materials with unpaired nucleons can shield external gravity fields like Earth's. Perhaps Biefeld Brown effect parallel plate capacitors shield the material above it from Earth's gravity field too. Experiments by R.H. Eskridge. In 2021, Eskridge, the father of the well-known Amy Eskridge, Eskridge directed a research proposal and paper for NASA named A Study of the Pope-Osborn Angular Momentum Synthesis Theory, including a mathematical reformulation and validation experiment. In the experiment, they rotated a disk of bismuth, which has an unpaired proton, and it lost and gained an identical amount of weight depending on being rotated clockwise or counterclockwise. His team proved there is a polarity to rotationally induced unpaired proton spin alignment, opening the possibility of other methods of unpaired proton spin alignment to have a polarity, perhaps with Biefeld Brown effect parallel plate capacitors. All right, my take on the capacitor array as a gravity shield. As mentioned, GE aerospace engineers' patents in the early 1970s, he stated that materials that have unpaired nucleons, such as copper and aluminum, who have an unpaired proton, can be used as a shield to block external gravitational fields. With the capacitor array on the bottom of the craft with half-inch thick copper plates, if Wallace is correct, they would shield the part of the craft above the capacitor array from Earth's gravity when the ARV is right side up. Furthermore, it is unclear from the patents if the copper needs its unpaired protons to be spin aligned to create the gravity shielding effect, but either way, if it does or doesn't, the capacitor array as built on the ARV would shield Earth's gravity, making the components of the craft lighter, like the solenoid electromagnetic coil around the circumference, as well as the crew compartment sphere. Okay, the ARV's electromagnetic coil. The electromagnetic coil around the circumference of the craft was said to contain braided cable in the McCandlish Schematic from 1989 and square copper rod in the Odovell book from 2010. In both sources, the conductor was around 1/4 inch in diameter and surrounded by about 1/4 inch of the same G10 dielectric insulation seen in the capacitor array. Traditionally, electromagnetic coils use very thin insulation coatings on the order of 1/1000th of an inch thick, and the turns of the coil are as close as possible to each other to generate the strongest field. The ARV's coil design indicates that high voltages are applied to the coil and therefore need thicker insulation to prevent dielectric breakdown and arcing. What matters in preventing, dielectric breakdown in a coil is the voltage difference between two adjacent windings or turns. So even though there's only 1/4 inch dielectric insulation around the coil's windings, it is possible that with the coil being about 1185 turns, windings in total, that voltages as high or higher than 1.2 million volts could be applied to it without the insulation around the coil from breaking down. It is possible that Novell's claim of a state change at that voltage applies to the coil and not the capacitor array. The electromagnetic coil around the circumference of the craft would have numerous uses in an aircraft or spacecraft. That is one main reason I believe in the ARV leak. Inertial mass reduction. I believe the electromagnetic coil is used primarily for inertial mass reduction. Inspired by the description of the ARV and the claims by Lockheed senior scientist Boyd Bushman, I have been conducting freefall experiments with magnets. I have found that magnets moving in the direction of their north to south pole experience acceleration rates greater than gravity. The type of electromagnetic coil seen in the ARV would also have a north and south pole. Just for reference, I have tried multiple configurations of magnets. Two attractively coupled, either being dropped north to south or south to north, and two repulsively coupled, being dropped, so there'd be south, north, and then the north pole forced against the north pole of the other magnet, and then south on the bottom, or north, south, south, north. I have come up with 4 possible hypotheses to explain the greater than gravity acceleration rates in my experiments with the 2 magnets attractively coupled moving in the direction of its north to south pole. The north to south, north-south magnet increases the gravitational mass of the object. The north-south, north-south magnet decreases the inertial mass of the object. The north-south, north-south magnet both increases the gravitational mass and decreases the inertial mass of the object. The north-south, north-south magnet contracts space-time at its south pole and expands it at its north pole when the magnet is in motion. Gravitational mass amplification experiment, a failure. To determine if gravitational mass was being affected, I used an analytical balance to weigh the mass of the north-south, north-south magnet versus flipping the magnet upside down, so south pole's on top and north pole's on the bottom. I also weighed 2 repulsively coupled magnets configured as north-south, south-north, and south-north, north-south. All magnets were virtually identical, weighing approximately 771 grams, including the aluminum bolt washers and hex nut. Therefore, the hypothesis considering an alteration of gravitational mass can be eliminated. That leaves 2 possible hypotheses to explain the greater than gravity acceleration rates in my experiments with magnets moving in the direction of its north to south pole. The magnet decreases the inertial mass of the object, or the magnet contracts space-time at its south pole and expands it at its north pole when the magnet is in motion. My take on the ARV's electromagnetic coil. Inertia reduction by engineering the vacuum. The Casimir effect was predicted in 1948 and experimentally verified in 1997. When two microscopic, uncharged conductive plates are placed close enough together, they get forced together by the energy of the vacuum. Essentially, the energy of the vacuum trails off rapidly with distance, but if the plates are placed close enough, there ends up being more force on the outside of the plates than is inside the plates, which is why the plates get pushed together when placed extremely close together. What is creating the force demonstrated by the Casimir effect? In quantum field theory, it is believed that virtual particle-antiparticle pairs are constantly popping into existence and annihilating. That minimum most amount of energy in the vacuum is called by some zero-point energy. When the particle pairs of positronium, composed of a positron and an electron, their particle and antiparticle pair, when they pop into existence, they usually rapidly annihilate and create short-lived, extremely high-energy photons known as gamma rays. These are dark gamma rays. They get the virtual gamma rays. Gamma rays, due to their high energy, impart more momentum on objects they collide with than any other type of photon. It is my hypothesis that these virtual particle pairs and short-lived dark gamma rays that are created upon their annihilation are behind the Casimir effect, and that virtual particle pairs can be manipulated prior to their annihilation to decouple a craft from the energy and momentum of collisions with virtual dark gamma rays. I believe these virtual gamma rays are responsible for inertia. I believe the Casimir effect can also be engineered to generate over-unity electricity, but I cannot say if such a device is what powers the ARV. Using a pulsed magnetic field or a moving static magnetic field, the coil's field imparts a torque on the virtual particles of positronium, causing their axis of spin to align with the magnetic field lines. When the virtual positronium annihilates, the two dark gamma rays are created, one traveling up, the other down, parallel to the field lines of the magnetic coil. Instead of impacting the ARV and imparting their momentum on the craft, they fly harmlessly before disappearing back into the vacuum. Also as a radiation shield. The electromagnetic coil, the electromagnetic coil will shield the craft from charged particles. Life on Earth is protected from the radiation present in outer space thanks to Earth's magnetic field and thick atmosphere. A powerful magnetic field around a spacecraft would insulate it from cosmic rays, high-energy electrically charged protons, and the solar wind, a steady stream of moderate-energy electrically charged gases. Unfortunately, a magnetic field is not capable of shielding a craft from high-energy photons, such as X-rays and gamma rays. If the ARV is creating a gravitational field of some kind, that field could shield the craft from those high-energy photons, but it is unknown if such a field is being created. Gas and liquid ionization. Static magnetic fields impart no energy to gases and liquids and are not capable of ionizing the materials in such fluids. Moving magnetic fields, especially pulsed moving magnetic fields on the other hand, can. If the pulses are of sufficiently high energy, they are able to ionize gases and liquids, breaking their chemical bonds and creating a plasma. It is my hypothesis that one use of the ARV's coil is to ionize the atmosphere around the craft. The benefit to such an action is that plasma can be moved out of the way of the ARV with the magnetic field as it travels, allowing it to travel faster than the speed of sound without creating sonic booms. Conclusion. Well, this is the start of the UFO UAP Experimental Physics Channel on YouTube. And there you have it. The alien reproduction vehicle leak is an incredibly detailed tale, one that to this citizen scientist believes has too much evidence behind it to be a tale of fiction created by Sorensen, McCandlish, and Sanderson Novell. The world will not know for sure one way or the other until the scientific community From academia to citizen scientists take on the hard work of conducting experiments based on and seeking to replicate the components of the ARV. Specifically for me, the inertia reducing electromagnetic coil and the Biefeld Brown effect parallel plate capacitor array. This citizen scientist has already started conducting free fall experiments with magnets to determine if inertial reduction is taking place with them, which would support the existence of electromagnetic coils and advanced spacecraft to enable inertial reduction on them. In addition to my existing drop experiments, I'm currently designing and have started building a rotary inertia detection machine that will rotate an aluminum disc at high speed with two magnets attached to its edges on opposite sides of the disc. The disc will be rotated in a direction where the magnets are moving in the direction of their north to south pole, and then the magnets will be flipped, moving so that the disc rotates them in the direction of their south to north pole. By using a stepper motor that is rotating at a fixed RPM and measuring the current used by the motor with a current sensor, and measuring the device with the two different magnet configurations, the current sensor should detect a difference in the amount of current used. Less current should be used when the magnets are moving in the direction of the north to south pole, if in fact inertial reduction is taking place. After that, I will be building a simultaneous drop device, an upgrade to my current drop device. This one will be approximately 3 times the height of my existing one, approximately 20 feet tall. One drop object will be a magnet moving in the direction of its north to south pole. The other will be a non-magnetic control object. I will be video recording the drops so people can see with their own eyes, especially with the higher drop height, that there is a difference in free fall acceleration between the two objects. Lastly, would it surprise you to know that there is not one peer-reviewed published experiment, not one, involving the conducting of free fall experiments with magnets? Isn't that odd? Expect my next video shortly. I'll be providing a history of free fall experiments with magnets that are in the public record. After that, but they're in the public record, but never been published in any physics journals. After that, expect roughly monthly updates on this channel regarding my inertia reduction experiments and, in time, Biefeld Brown effect capacitor experiments. I'll be working with any interested parties in building and replicating my experiments by providing the CAD designs and Arduino code for free, along with lists of URLs where parts were purchased, all in an attempt to increase the notoriety of these experiments and push the science into the public world for the benefit of humanity. Thanks for watching. My work is also available on my website, robertfrancisjr.com. I believe the quickest path to making inertial mass reduction and Biefeld Brown effect propulsion technology public is for us to conduct and replicate such experiments and publish our data. Goodbye.